Hello everybody, again this is week 3, Professor Jackal Tanalor, and we're going to cover chapters 8 and 11. Recap for the main points of week 2, you learned that ethnography is the method unique to anthropology. Participant observation is where the researcher lives among the community for at least a year. Different from sociology, anthropologists typically study small groups of people, but now can include subcultures within industrialized nations. Ethnology is the comparative study of various ethnographies. Language was an adaptive strategy and a major factor in developing culture, and we learned that social rankings within a language create language prejudices between high and low variance. So this week we're going to look at race and gender, or rather gender roles and racial categories. So, names to know. We already learned about Franz Boas, but let's study him a little bit more. Franz Boas trained many anthropologists at his time at Columbia University, including some very famous women in the field. Margaret Mead was important in the second phase of feminist anthropology. Ruth Benedict, who was one of Franz Boas' first female anthropologist, was a friend and rumored lover to Margaret Mead. Zora Neale Hurston, some of you might have heard of, is an African-American folklorist. She was also an anthropologist who studied under Franz Boas. And then there's Gladys Amanda Richard, who was a linguistic anthropologist. Another name to know is Leila Abu-Lughod. She argues that Western society's desire to save Muslim women from Islamic religion is ethnocentric and neither needed nor wanted. The last person I want you to know is Frank Wu. Frank Wu is not an anthropologist, but a distinguished law professor and author of the book Yellow, Race in America Beyond Black and White, a book I think everyone should read. So the first thing I want to talk about is prejudice, stereotypes, and discrimination. When you read chapters 8 and 11, this will come in, but not until the end of chapter 11. Prejudice, stereotype, and discrimination is important to talk about at the beginning of this video because it impacts both of these groups probably more than any other group that we'll talk about this semester. And we need to understand the differences between prejudice, stereotypes, and discrimination because these things have impacted both of these groups to different degrees throughout time, including today. Discrimination refers to policies and practices that harm a group and its members. Discrimination can be de facto, which is practiced but not legally sanctioned, such as women making less money for doing the same job as the men who do it. Or de jure, meaning part of the law. An example of de jure discrimination would be women not having the right to vote nationally until 1920. 50 years after black men were given the right to vote. Not that they could actually use it. Prejudice is devaluing a group, just like devaluing women's labor through the de facto discrimination of lesser pay. Stereotypes are fixed, often unfavorable, ideas about how members of a group are, what they're capable of or incapable of, their level of intelligence, their value as a member of society. It was stereotypes that led to the de jure discrimination belief that neither blacks nor women were capable or politically aware enough to vote in a federal election. In week 1, we briefly talked about race being culturally constructive and not a biological reality. Spoiler alert, ethnicity is not necessarily biological either, but ethnicity is based on the common belief of a group that they share a common ancestry. Ethnic groups share a specific set of beliefs, values, customs, and norms. Wait, how is that different than our definition of culture? Ethnic groups' identity may include a collective name, a sense of solidarity, i.e. we all stick together, and an association with a specific territory. And I think therein lies the specific of ethnicity. But we're going to see how that changes throughout time. So let's take Jewish people as our example. Jews believe they descend from Abraham, and even before that, Adam and Eve. They share a religion, they share a language, Hebrew, and they share a name. They believe in a homeland, Israel, a territory that first existed circa 930 BCE. They definitely have a shared solidarity that can make even strangers bond. But are Jews biologically all related? No. There's just too much genetic diversity for all Jewish people to trace back to a single ancestor. So let's shift a little bit and look at how ethnicity relates to national identity. A nation offers a territorial identity attached to a collective name: American, Mexican, Israeli. 2, it offers a solidarity typically through the military. We will protect this nation. And 3, it offers a generally shared language and a religion. Again, let's consider Jewish people as our example. What do you think is the main language and main religion of Israel? If you said Hebrew and Judaism, you would be right. But did you know that there are actually 2 official languages of Israel? Hebrew and Arabic. So there are 2 main points in the discussion about ethnicity. 1, although there are very few, if any, truly separate biologically based ethnic groups today, people can still feel a sense of belonging and solidarity to an ethnic identity. And 2, national identity has and can replace ethnic identity. Without ethnic identity, however, racial categories could not exist. Racial categories are the basic not me category. It is the way we talk about the other. But now I want to talk about 2 things to help you understand how race is socially constructed, and even though racial categories are made up, the consequences based on these racial classifications are very real, and in many cases, deadly. The easiest way for me to explain the racial categories are artificial are to show you 3 examples of census categories from 3 different countries. And I'm going to use the big 3 of North America: Canada, the United States, and Mexico. So in Canada, as the text shows, the term visible minority is used in census data. Yet this excludes indigenous populations or First Nations people from the visible minority category. In the USA, as noted in many of the videos presented, the US Census data has changed and rechanged so many times that a person's racial classification can change from one census to the next, and even by crossing state lines. Mexico doesn't use skin color or race at all. There are only 2 ways to determine this type of difference through census data in Mexico, and that is through questions on indigenous language spoken and the country of origin. However, Mexico's immigration office does ask you for the skin color, but it only gives 3 options: negro, moreno, y blanco, black, brown, or white. So census data might be too abstract. It's not real because it's just numbers on a page, right? But I have 2 stories that also show how racial categories change across borders.
In Mexico, we really don't look that much at race. We all consider ourselves mestizos, or a mixed race. We all recognize that we have some European blood, some indigenous blood. I was taking graduate courses that were very small in size, maybe 10 students. There was one class where they were all males. It was only me, a female, and of course the only one that was a foreigner. And I remember for the whole term raising my hand to try to participate in the program, and the teacher just wouldn't give me an opportunity to participate. I have to say I never approached him directly, but when I did speak to another person at the university, he said, "Well, you have to understand that you're brown," and that is very, very curious because actually in Mexico, even though I'm not, I'm usually called blondie. The other story I want to share is from April Anderson. Her story is about being African American living in Mexico. What is it like for you to be African American in Mexico?
It's very different than being an African American in the U.S. In the U.S. system, Black people are some of the most visible targets of racism. In Mexico, uh, racism is much more directed at indigenous people. There is a clear hierarchy about beauty in Mexico, and beauty is clearly associated with whiteness, tallness, skinniness, which is very different than the body types of many people here, in particular. The body types associated with indigenous people. It's really interesting not to be the target of racism, and instead to be the target of this kind of odd curiosity. The first thing people ask is where I'm from, and I tell them. Sometimes they want to understand how I ended up being from the United States. Tell them that my family came during the era of slavery. Once people find out that I'm from the U.S. and I speak English, I get a lot of privilege and respect. The amount of privilege associated with being an English speaker, and then on top of that, a person from the U.S. is very, it's a lot of privilege. If I tell people that I have a PhD, it's giving me certain types of respect that would not always be available to me as a Black person in the U.S. I mean, I think in the U.S., people look at you, they see you're a Black person. That's and there are all these stereotypes associated with Blackness. Whereas here, I'm in a different category altogether. I'm kind of in the category of foreigner. I am a Black person, and people notice my color. People associate Blackness here with the Caribbean. I used to get Cuban a lot because people in Mexico associate Cubans with Blackness. I've gotten Haitian a lot. Random people want to approach me to practice English or French or whatever language they think I speak.
If there isn't a global consensus on what is the correct classification of a person's race or even skin color, there can be no biological basis for racial categories. But please don't be fooled into believing that we should all be colorblind. As far as I know, colorblindness is always considered a defect, not an asset. And colorblindness does not help us address the real consequences of racial classifications. There are real life and death consequences that have occurred due to these racial classifications. One can see this in such movements as Black Lives Matter. And in Mexico, even as Mexicans imagine themselves as mestizo, or a mix between Spanish and indigenous peoples, people see indigenous people as stereotypically poor, backwards, uneducated, and even ugly. Whereas being African American in Mexico can allow you privileges unheard of in the United States. And again, this shows how racial categories don't carry the same meaning from one country to the next. So gender. Let's talk about sex. Let's talk about sex and gender. We already mentioned that race is a social construction. But are you ready to hear that gender is a social construction too? Well, it is. The reason we know this is because gender roles are not the same across all cultures. There are definitely generalities, but the way gender roles are defined is not culturally universal. Biological sex is. Now, before someone jumps down my throat about there being way more than two sexes, which I know, by the way, let's talk about nature versus nurture. What is biological about sex, and what is cultural about gender? Are you a man? Are you a woman? Are you a third gender? Intersex? Genderqueer? Biologically, we talk about sex as the genitalia one has when a person is born. If you had a penis when you were born, you were assigned the label male. If you had a vagina when you were born, you were assigned the label female. And if you had both, well, according to Wikipedia, there are only two countries in the world, Kenya and Malta, where a person born intersex has access to legal documentation. And biological differences don't stop there. Once a child hits puberty, the female sex begins developing breasts, while the male sex grows facial hair and takes on more height and muscle mass. Gender identity, however, is all cultural. These are social characteristics that determine how we identify and how others identify us. Gender roles are the tasks and activities that a culture assigns to the sexes. These are the behaviors that we consider normal for our gender. So I want to tell you about the story about a friend of mine who, when he was a little boy, his grandfather would give him money to go buy candy at the store. He got 2 quarters. And his grandmother would look at him and she would say, "Make sure you buy your girl cousins candy." Little girl cousins would accompany him to the store to pick out their candy, but he paid for it. So he was being taught how to provide for the girl, and the girl was being taught how to be dependent on the man. Later in life, sadly enough, his mother died. Julio was put in the position of taking on certain chores because he lived in an all-male house. It was himself, his dad, and all brothers. His chores were cooking, so he cleaned the house and he took on chores that might be considered traditionally female. And then there's sexual orientation identity. How we assign gender roles often determine what we consider a person's sexual orientation to be. What I'm talking about are gender stereotypes of a culture or a society. Patriarchal societies, where men are the political leaders, this led to extreme gender stratification. Women started receiving less and less status and less rights. So again, I'm going to leave it there because otherwise this video will go on forever. Your discussion board assignment this week is compare and contrast. That's the methodology that we're using, is comparing and contrasting. You need to upload the video of yourself analyzing 2 advertisements. These can be still images or they can be 2 video ads. And compare things that are comparable, right? Like don't compare the suntan lotion with the tennis shoe ad. Compare 2 suntan lotions, 2 tennis shoe ads, 2 ads for a soap product, whatever you want. Try to compare and contrast if these are contributing to gender or racial stereotypes or if they're trying to counteract gender and racial stereotypes, and then see what your peers think about your analysis and contribute to your peers' analysis of their own. Again, if you have any questions, I'm always available through my email.